I'm going to demonstrate two ways to do knitted buttons, and I have a swatch here that I've picked up stitches and started doing a buttonhole band. I like to do this as a test on my swatch before I do a buttonhole band on the full sweater, so I can make sure that the edges line up nicely, which means that I've picked up at the right ratio. I have a separate video about that, and also so that I can try my buttonholes with my buttons in advance and decide which one to do. I usually test out two, and these are the two I generally do. So first up, I'm going to knit a few stitches, and then I'm going to do a basic eyelet buttonhole, which is generally done as a yarn over, which is wrap around the needle, and then knit two together. It could also be yarn over purl two together, especially if you're doing a rib and you need to keep in pattern, or it could be even knit two together then a yarn over, which gives you a slightly larger buttonhole, so you can play around with those variations. The other buttonhole that I do when I have a bigger button is a bound off buttonhole. And that one I do by binding off a certain number of stitches. I'll usually take my button and lay it down to see how many of my stitches it covers up, and then bind off one less than that. I'm going to try doing 2 stitches for this. It might need 3, but my guess is that 3 will be a little loose. It's a balance where you want the button to go through the buttonhole, but not so easily it pops out. So I've knit 2 more stitches. I'm going to bind one off and knit 1 more stitch and bind a second one off. So here I am at the end of the row. With a bound off buttonhole, I need to replace those 2 stitches on the next row by casting on, and I have a particular cast on that I think works really nicely. So I'm going to turn it around and knit to my gap. I'm working my band and garter stitch, but depending on your pattern, you might be doing a rib or some other stitch. Now here I'm at my gap, it's quite obvious, and I need to replace these stitches. So what I like to do is a double twisted loop cast on. So I'm just going to take my yarn and turn it, I'm turning my hand counterclockwise, so you can see one little cross here. I'm going to turn it one more time, and this is what we're looking for. You've got 2 crosses on your yarn. Then I'm going to put on my needle and gently tug to snug it up, heading for about the same tension as everything else. So again, turn the yarn counterclockwise, 1 cross, turn it again, and that's what we want, where you can see that full twist happening. It is much better to turn it twice. There is a cast on where you just turn it once, which I don't think is very sturdy, and I don't think it looks as good. Now I'm just going to keep knitting along. When I get to my eyelet buttonhole, I'm going to have this unusual stitch. That's my yarn over. I do want to knit it just like any other stitch. It'll feel a little loose and weird, but we put it there for a reason. After that, I would continue with my button band. I'm going to go ahead and knit another row just to get a little ways away here. And then I generally even bind off my little faux button band on my swatch, because it'll give me a chance to test my binding off and see if I want to do a different bind off. Now this is my cast on stitch. It's a little tight, so you can see I'm just using my finger to sneak in there. You can also slide it a little closer to the tip of the needle. Just be careful it doesn't fall off, but if it does, you can pick it back up and go all the way to the end of my row. Now, as I was saying, I do generally bind these off so that I can test out whether my bind off looks good, whether it's stretchy enough, too tight, too loose, all of that. So I'm just going to do this with a pretty common chain bind off. And I want to keep these stitches a little loose as I go. I don't need this to be a especially stretchy edge the way I would with a neckband, but I also don't want it to be so tight that it pulls in and gathers the front edge of my cardigan. Generally the buttonhole row where you create the holes is worked about halfway through the button band between the pickup row and your bind off row. So if it's an odd number, it would definitely be in the middle. If it's an even number, check your pattern, but I usually do it a little closer to the pickup row if I need to decide. And at the end of my bind off, we will snip my yarn, tie it off, and then it's time to take a look at these buttonholes. So I've got 2 buttonholes. This one is my eyelet buttonhole, that's my bound off buttonhole. happen to grab 2 size buttons so we can try them on. So the smaller button fits through the eyelet buttonhole quite nicely. You can see I've got to push it a bit. There's a little resistance. That's just about a perfect fit so that it won't pull out on its own. The bigger buttonhole is not going to fit there. Let's try it on this bigger one that I made for it. And here again you can see it's stretching a little bit to get through, but it's not really hard. So that is perfect. If I'd bound off 3, it would have been so big it would have just popped right out on it. So that's what I do to test out my buttons. And then were this a real sweater, I'd be ready to pick up and do my buttonhole band.